This used to be an easy parable for me. See, although I didn't grow up poor myself, I grew up in a very poor community. One of the poorest in California. Now, my grandfather worked in the fields pretty much his entire life. My mom and her siblings, when they were young, they worked in the fields. I didn't have to. My mom went to college, became a school teacher, so I was pretty fortunate. But most of my friends, the kids I grew up with and went to school with, they worked in the fields. Their parents worked in the fields. Their siblings all worked in the fields. In fact, many of my friends lived in the labor camp, one of the last working labor camps in the Central Valley. See, I knew the poor. I lived with the poor. I played with the poor. I grew up among the poor. They were my people. So I knew whose side I was on in this parable. In fact, I used to hear this parable with a sense of excitement and a feeling of justice. Because here was this guy, this rich man, who doesn't even get a name. Think about that for a minute. A wealthy man who dressed in the finest linens, who feasted scrumptiously. I could just picture him being one of those guys. Like, do you know who I am? I could just picture him. People would have known his name, right? Somebody like this doesn't live in anonymity. You see his house and you know who lives there. So for him not to get a name in this parable, I'll be honest with you, that felt good. It felt good. Because it's usually the people who matter less who aren't named. So I read this parable as a story of a wealthy man who gets what he has coming to him. And it was easy because I knew who I was in this parable, or at least whose side I was on. Lazarus was one of my people. Because I care about the poor. I could put that on my resume. I've advocated for pesticide safety regulations in Tulare County, where that's not a very popular thing to do. But I advocated so that children wouldn't have to breathe in poison on their way to school. I advocated for people who lawmakers said weren't important enough for laws to be changed to protect them. Yet I knew exactly whose side I was on in this parable. I was like, get those angels ready for me when I depart. And I felt pretty righteous when I read this parable. But maybe there's more to the story. And this isn't to let anyone off the hook. But perhaps I was misreading the sin. Perhaps I was misreading my own location, my own placement on the side of the chasm. Because if I am content to let the privileged be cast off to Hades where they beg to be cooled by the wet finger of a homeless man, then how am I any better off? You see, perhaps the sin isn't being lavishly rich while another is poor. But the sin is not seeing one another. The sin is allowing the chasm to remain and even grow wider. Because if I listen to the scripture that I read last week, I might be reminded that God desires salvation for all. For all. And while the Gospel of Luke sure does seem to imply that God favors the poor, it doesn't say anywhere in Scripture that being wealthy in and of itself is a crime punishable by death. Now, certainly, Scripture has much to say about how we use wealth, as well as what happens if we allow wealth to be our guiding principle, right? But it's the indifference. It's the indifference that is the true sin. Furthermore, it's the demonization of others that truly saddens God. You know, we could point out all kinds of ways in which the poor continue to be demonized. Even today, even in a country that is just soaked so richly in Christian heritage, even in a country whose resources are not matched throughout history, we demonize the lowly immigrants who come here to, quote, bilk the system, or to, quote, take away our jobs. We demonize the homeless who are, quote, ruining our cities. We continue to perpetuate this us versus them kind of mentality as if they are not ours, as if they're not family. And then what we see as a reaction, as perhaps a way of putting ourselves on the right side of the chasm, is that we demonize those who we see as the rich man in this parable because it cannot possibly be us. Here's the thing that is so hard about this parable, because it's not as easy anymore. This parable, which Jesus turns the table so well. It's that it's not just the rich beggar who has the tables turned on him, as he goes from having everything to having to beg Lazarus. And isn't it ironic that he knows his name? He begs to be saved. He begs to have his family saved. But it's us too. We have the tables turned on us. If we still allow ourselves to choose sides on this chasm instead of seeking to bridge the gap. If we allow ourselves to be blind to the plight of the poor and at the same time be blind to the fate of the privileged, then we are ignoring the messengers that are being sent out to save us now. The thing is, just like the rich beggar's brothers who he pleads for, we also have Moses and the prophets who have cried out to us to act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. And for good measure, we have the risen Christ. We have the hindsight to know how far God is willing to go for us. You see, ultimately what this parable is telling us is not a matter of what happens after death, but that we should be concerned with what happens in the here and now. And we have the ability to experience a foretaste of God's kingdom now if we seek to just truly live in community. When we choose to live with our eyes open to our neighbors of all stripes, everywhere on the socioeconomic spectrum, when we seek to live for the well-being of everyone around us, not just our own, that's when we're living in the way that God intended. Now here's the good news, because I do believe there's good news. While this parable sure does sound like a warning, let's not miss out on the invitation. Because that is what Jesus does. Jesus invites us into a more full relationship with God and with our neighbors. A relationship in which we are less concerned with our own fate and more concerned with feasting together. Sharing the best of what we have right now. Because right now, friends, is not the time to scramble to see if we can make it to the right side of the chasm. But it's time that we connect our hands together, despite our differences, narrowing the chasm. Right now is the time to begin living in a way that honors Jesus' call to seek the lost, to offer grace to the rich, to remember that Jesus rewrites the guest list to include some surprising people, even you and me. The messengers are out there, friends. We don't have to beg to hear them. just have to open our eyes.